Have you ever noticed? The more tightly we hold something, the more it seems to slip away. It's strange, isn't it? We grip love, success, certainty, like we're afraid they'll vanish if we loosen our hold even slightly. But what if the act of holding on is exactly what creates our suffering? There's an old Buddhist saying that changed my life. The cup is already broken. It sounds harsh at first, but hidden in that sentence is a quiet doorway to peace. One that doesn't ask us to give up love or beauty, but to hold them gently. Because nothing in this world lasts forever. And maybe that's what makes it all so precious. In today's video, we'll explore a story that has softened hearts for centuries. A tale of a monk, a cup, and the unexpected freedom found in letting go. Along the way, I'll share a moment from my own life where everything I clung to shattered, and yet something more honest began to bloom. And near the end, there's a powerful image, one I still carry with me, that might change how you hold the people and memories you love. So if your heart is tired of clinging, come sit with me for a while. And if you feel called, press subscribe, not just to follow this channel, but to walk this path together. Chapter 1. The cup was always broken, learning to let go with gentle hands. I once believed that if I held on tightly enough, I could keep the things I loved from slipping away. People, moments, certainties, I gripped with both hands. Not because I didn't trust life, but because I was terrified of what might happen if I didn't. Maybe you've been there too, sitting quietly in the early morning light, wondering why something that once felt whole now feels so far away. Wondering why, even when everything looks fine from the outside, there's this soft ache that keeps humming beneath the surface. There's an old story I often come back to, like a cup of warm tea I sip when my heart feels too full or too fragile. It's simple, but it changed how I see the world. A young monk was given a porcelain cup by his teacher, not just any cup, but one the master had used for years. It was delicate, smooth, slightly translucent in the morning light. The monk treasured it. Every day he would rinse it carefully, dry it with clean cloth, place it gently on a wooden shelf beside his bed. He loved it, admired it, protected it. He held it with the reverence one might offer to something sacred or something feared to be lost. Then one day, the cup slipped from his fingers and shattered into 100 pieces on the cold stone floor. He stared at the fragments, a hollow blooming in his chest. The room felt suddenly too big, too still. His hands trembled. He had failed to keep it safe. His master, hearing the sound, walked in calmly and looked at the shards. Then, with a softness that only time and wisdom could teach, he said, "That cup was already broken. That was it. No scolding, no sadness, just truth." The cup had always been destined to break because everything in time does. The beauty, the gift, was not in preventing its fall, but in cherishing it while it lasted, in loving it without trying to keep it forever. I remember the first time I heard this story. I didn't understand it right away. In fact, I resisted it fiercely. Something in me wanted to say, but if we don't hold on, won't we lose everything? The idea of letting go felt cruel, like giving up. But over time, and through my own quiet heartbreaks, I started to see the wisdom inside that paradox. Detachment, at least in the Buddhist sense, is not coldness. It's not about becoming numb, or withdrawing, or refusing to care. It's about loving without clutching. It's about holding with open hands, like watching a butterfly land gently on your finger, and instead of closing your palm to keep it, you smile and let it fly. There's a strange thing that happens when we hold too tightly. The very act of clinging creates suffering. Imagine trying to hold sand. The more you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. And yet we do this all the time. We cling to relationships that no longer nourish us, to jobs that drain us, to memories that have turned into ghosts. We say things like, "But I've invested so much," or "What if it never comes back?" And beneath it all, a quiet fear murmurs, "I don't know who I am without this." I remember a time in my life when I was deeply attached to a role I played, a career that had become part of my identity. It gave me purpose, approval, a sense of control. But it also demanded parts of me I didn't realize I was giving away. I was exhausted, constantly anxious, and yet the thought of leaving felt impossible. Who would I be without that title, that daily rhythm? And then, without warning, the role disappeared, like the cup, gone. I was left staring at the shattered pieces of what I thought defined me. In the silence that followed, something strange happened. I didn't collapse. I didn't dissolve. Instead, I noticed space. And in that space, I found something far more tender than achievement. I found myself raw, unsure, but real. I wasn't clinging anymore, and somehow I was freer. You see, detachment doesn't ask us to stop loving. It asks us to love more purely, to love with presence, not possession. When we know something isn't ours to keep, we tend to cherish it more deeply, like a sunset you know will soon fade, or the last page of a beloved book. There's an aliveness in impermanence, if we're willing to meet it without fear. The Buddha taught that all suffering begins with attachment, tanha, or craving. We crave stability in a world that constantly changes. We crave certainty in a life made of shifting sands. And while that craving is deeply human, it also blinds us to the beauty of what is. So how do we begin to loosen our grip? Maybe it starts with noticing. Noticing when the need to control tightens your chest. Noticing when you speak from fear rather than trust. Noticing what you're holding on to not because it brings joy, but because you're afraid of who you'd be without it. And then gently you begin to open your hand. I often imagine that broken cup dissolving into golden light, like a symbol of all the things we try to preserve that were never ours to hold. Not in the sense of abandonment, but in the sense of reverence. Can we learn to thank what was and let it go? There's a kind of peace that comes when we stop trying to prevent life from being life. When we allow ourselves to be here, in this breath, in this moment, without needing to control what comes next. It's like sitting by a river and watching it flow, instead of trying to dam it up or direct it. Just watching, trusting. This doesn't mean we don't act. It doesn't mean we become passive or detached from the world. In fact, true detachment allows us to show up more fully, because we're not acting from fear, we're acting from love. We're not trying to control outcomes. We're engaging with what is. Sometimes this shows up in small, quiet ways, like choosing to say goodbye to someone not because you don't care, but because you finally care enough about yourself to release what hurts. Like walking away from a version of your life that once fit, but now feels too tight, knowing you deserve to grow. Like sitting alone at dawn with tears in your eyes, whispering thank you to a chapter that ended. Not because it was painless, but because it taught you how to breathe again. Letting go doesn't mean erasing. It means remembering without reattaching. It means honoring without reliving. It means moving forward without dragging every broken piece behind you. In the monastery, the cup shattered and the master smiled. That image stays with me. A room quiet with fragments, and a teacher who sees the lesson not in loss, but in liberation. Maybe you, like me, have some pieces you've been holding. Maybe there's something or someone you've tried to keep intact long after its time has passed. What if you placed it down with love? What if you whispered, you were already broken, and that's okay? And then, what if you allowed something new to be born in that space? The lotus, after all, doesn't bloom in clean water. It rises from the mud, from the mess, from the endings we never wanted but needed. This is not a call to stop caring. It's a call to care more courageously, to love with your palms open, to feel the ache of beauty and still say yes. The cup was always broken, but while it lasted, wasn't it beautiful? So let it break, let it go, let it teach you, and in the silence that follows, you might just hear the sound of your own soul, finally exhaling. Chapter 2. The wave was never meant to stop on meeting life as it is. I used to think that if I planned well enough, tried hard enough, did all the right things in the right order, life would reward me with ease. That things would line up neatly like stepping stones across a river. One foot after the other, no surprises, no slips. I thought suffering was a sign I had done something wrong. That discomfort was a glitch, something to be solved, avoided, or outrun. But life, as it does, had other ideas. And the more I tried to resist what was happening, the heavier it all became, like trying to hold back a wave with my bare hands. There's a line from a Zen teacher that once stopped me in my tracks. He said, "You suffer because you resist what is." Just 7 words, but they felt like a mirror held gently to my face. Not to scold me, but to show me something I hadn't wanted to see. You suffer, not because life is cruel, not because the situation is hopeless, but because you're fighting the truth of this moment as if it were the enemy. What a revelation, and also what a humbling thing to realize, that most of my pain wasn't coming from the situation itself, but from my refusal to accept it. My resistance, my insistence that reality should be something else. Imagine standing on a beach and seeing a wave approach. You dig your heels into the sand, plant your feet, raise your arms and shout, "Stop!" But the wave doesn't care. It doesn't pause. It doesn't respond to your commands. Simply crashes as waves always do. And in that moment, you have 2 choices. You can keep fighting the ocean, angry, soaked, exhausted, or you can dive into the wave. Let it lift you. Let it carry you. Let it teach you to float. That's what acceptance feels like. But please understand, acceptance isn't giving up. It's not saying, "Oh well, I guess I'll just suffer forever." It's not passivity. It's clarity. It's the spaciousness that arises when we stop wasting our energy on arguing with reality and start responding to it with wisdom. I learned this the hard way. A few years ago, someone I loved deeply chose a different path. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet, painful unraveling. At first, I did what most of us do. I resisted. I replayed every conversation, tried to rewrite the ending, clung to the idea that if I said or did the right thing, things would go back to how they were. But the more I fought, the more I sank. Couldn't sleep. I lost my appetite. I walked through my days like a ghost trying to live in a story that no longer existed. Then one night, and I remember this clearly, I was sitting on the floor beside my bed, curled up in one of those quiet kinds of cries that don't even make sound anymore. And a thought floated up, gentle and startling. This is happening. Not this shouldn't be happening. Not why is this happening. Just this is happening. And I realized in that moment, I had never actually let myself accept it. I had been living in resistance, not reality. And it had been tearing me apart. So I breathed in, and I whispered it out loud. This is happening. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the ache. But it was the first moment I felt peace. Acceptance creates space, not for suffering, but for truth. And from truth comes possibility. There's a story I love, one that lives close to my heart. It's about an archer, a master of his craft. He practices every day, adjusts his posture, his breathing, his focus. He knows how to calculate distance, how to read the weight of the bow. But no matter how skilled he is, there are always elements beyond his control. The wind, the movement of the target, even the trembling of his own hand. He has 2 choices: curse the wind or adjust his aim. And that's life, isn't it? No matter how much we prepare, there will always be wins we didn't expect. Losses we couldn't prevent. Changes we didn't ask for. But instead of cursing the wind, we can learn to move with it. To bend instead of break. To adapt instead of resist. Psychology calls this radical acceptance. It means looking reality in the eye, not through a lens of wishful thinking or judgment, but through presence. It means saying, this is what's here. Now what can I do with it? It's not about resignation. It's about reclaiming your power. Because when you accept what is, you finally stop pouring your energy into what isn't. Sometimes this shows up in small ways, like being stuck in traffic when you're already late, and instead of yelling at the steering wheel, you take a breath and play your favorite song. Other times, it's much bigger, accepting a diagnosis or the end of a relationship, or the fact that something you hoped for simply isn't going to happen. And none of that is easy. In fact, it might be the hardest spiritual muscle we ever develop. But with each breath of acceptance, we build strength. Not the hard, brittle kind of strength that resists, but the soft, resilient kind that flows. One of my friends once said, acceptance doesn't mean I like it. It just means I stop lying to myself about it. And there's so much wisdom in that. Because how often do we prolong our pain by pretending something is still working? A job, a friendship, a version of ourselves, long after it's asking to be released. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is whisper, This is where I am, and that's okay. There's a garden at the back of a monastery I visited years ago. In the early mornings, if you sit quietly enough, you can hear the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a temple bell. One morning, a monk was sweeping the path when I asked him what he thought the hardest part of the spiritual path was. He looked up, smiled, and said, "Letting things be as they are." It sounded so simple, but it felt like the deepest truth. Letting things be as they are doesn't mean we stop growing. It means we grow from truth, from the real soil beneath our feet, not some imagined ground we wish we had. And yes, there will be waves. Waves of sadness, of change, of things not going the way we'd hoped. But the wave isn't the enemy. It's just life moving. So the question becomes, will you fight it or will you float? Some of the most peaceful people I know aren't those who've had the easiest lives. They're the ones who stopped resisting, who learned to breathe even in the middle of a storm, who cry when they need to cry, rest when they need to rest, and say yes to what is, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And from that realness, they rise, just like you can, just like we all can. So if today you're feeling overwhelmed by change, by uncertainty, by something you didn't choose, maybe start here. Not with trying to fix it, but with simply saying, "This is happening." Let that be enough for now. Let that open the door. And maybe, just maybe, on the other side of that door is a gentler way of being. One where you don't have to hold it all together. One where life still hurts sometimes, but it doesn't crush you. One where you learn to ride the waves and discover that even in the chaos, there is a peace that floats, quiet, steady, already within you. Chapter 3. The butterfly knows when to fly, trusting the timing of your becoming. I used to believe that good things only came to those who pushed hard enough. That if I just ran faster, worked harder, figured it all out quicker than everyone else, life would reward me. That pain could be outrun, and peace could be earned by sheer will. But somewhere along the way, life whispered something else. It didn't come in a grand revelation. It came in a quiet, aching moment. A time when I had tried to force something into existence and watched it unravel anyway. All my effort, all my planning, undone by a timing that simply wasn't ready yet. There's an old story you may have heard about a man who came across a butterfly struggling to emerge from its cocoon. He saw it fighting, pushing, twisting. Its tiny body trembled, and the opening seemed too small, too cruel. So with gentle fingers and good intentions, he decided to help. He took a small knife and widened the opening, just a little, and sure enough, the butterfly came out. But its wings were weak, crumpled, never flew. The man didn't know that the struggle itself, that sacred discomfort, was what gave the wings their strength. That the pushing, the resistance, the patience, it was part of the becoming. I've thought about that story 1,000 times, especially in the moments I've tried to rush my own unfolding. When I begged for clarity before confusion had finished its teaching. When I pulled at relationships not ready to blossom. When I tried to force a version of myself into the world that hadn't fully formed yet. We live in a culture obsessed with acceleration. Move faster, achieve earlier, fall in love quickly, heal instantly. Even our suffering is expected to be productive. We treat time like an enemy, and impatience like a badge of honor. But nature, if we're paying attention, tells a different story. Have you ever watched a lotus bloom? It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It simply unfolds, petal by petal, in perfect silence. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes at dusk, but always when it's ready. There's a kind of wisdom in waiting, not the passive, avoidant kind, but the deep, grounded knowing that things take the time they take. That struggle isn't a mistake. That the cocoon isn't punishment, it's protection. A quiet, dark, necessary place of transformation. I once met a woman, let's call her Lila, who had just come out of a divorce. She was in her early 50s, radiant and raw all at once. "Everyone keeps telling me to get back out there," she said, laughing softly over a cup of tea. "But I feel like I'm still in the cocoon." She wasn't broken. She was healing, learning to sit with herself, letting the silence teach her what noise had always drowned out. And even though some days were lonely, she told me she'd rather be alone and true than accompanied and lost. She wasn't waiting for a man or a fix or a rescue. She was waiting for herself. And it was beautiful. In Buddhism, we speak often of dukkha, suffering, or more precisely, the discomfort of being in a world that is always changing. One of the reasons we suffer, the Buddha said, is because we crave not just things but outcomes, control, timing. We cling to how we think it should unfold, rather than allowing life to reveal its own rhythm. This craving creates tension. We grasp, we push, we expect spring in the middle of winter, and when life doesn't follow our script, we panic. But what if the delay is part of the mercy? There's a phrase I once heard from a forest monk in Thailand. He said, "Don't pull the bamboo." I asked what he meant, and he smiled, gesturing to a young stalk behind the temple. You can't make it grow faster by pulling it. You'll only break it. It made me laugh at the time, and it stuck with me quietly, because I've pulled at a lot of bamboo in my life. Relationships that weren't ready, projects that weren't ripe, healing that needed more seasons than I was willing to give it. And in my hurry to get there, I often missed the sacredness of being here. There's a kind of gentle suffering that arises when we push past our own readiness. It doesn't always look like drama. Sometimes it looks like constant anxiety, like subtle self-judgment, like waking up at 3 a.m. with a quiet question buzzing beneath your ribs. Why isn't it happening yet? And maybe the answer is because you're still growing your wings, because the cocoon hasn't finished whispering, because life is still aligning the pieces behind the curtain in ways you cannot yet see. I remember a time I was deeply in love with someone. We had a beautiful connection, soul-level, poetic, the kind that makes you believe in past lives. But something always felt a step out of sync. I wanted to move forward. He was still unhealed. I tried to wait. He tried to leap. And somewhere in the in-between, it fell apart. For a long time, I blamed the timing. I thought, if only he had healed sooner, or if only I had pushed harder. But eventually, I began to see, even in heartbreak, that rushing love doesn't make it last. That no matter how deep the feeling, nothing thrives before its time. And more than that, I realized I had my own timing to honor, my own wings to strengthen, my own cocoon to thank. In meditation, we're taught to observe, not react, to notice the urge to move, but stay still, to feel the itch, the ache, the thought, and just watch. No judgment, no rush. It's a training in presence. And presence is what keeps us from cutting open our own cocoon out of panic. Presence says, trust. Trust that what is unfolding in you is holy, even when it's messy, even when it's not Instagrammable, even when no one else can see it. Trust that rest is part of the rhythm, that stillness is not stagnation, that delay is not denial. It's easy to trust when things go as planned, but the deeper trust, the transformative kind, is built in the quiet hours, when nothing seems to be happening, when the soil looks empty, but the roots are growing underneath. So maybe today, if you're feeling behind or not enough, or aching with the pressure to arrive already, take a breath. Remember the butterfly. Remember the farmer who knows that pulling the plant won't make it grow. Remember the lotus blooming slowly, silently, untouched by the urge to perform. And maybe say to yourself, I don't have to be there yet. I don't need to rush my healing. I trust the unfolding. I trust the timing. I trust that my wings are forming, even now. And when they're ready, when you're ready, you will fly. Chapter 4. The river already knows the way, surrendering the need to control. I used to think that if I held on tightly enough, steered carefully enough, anticipated every twist, I could somehow avoid the pain. That if I just stayed alert, prepared, and perfectly in control, life would reward me with certainty. But life doesn't work like that, does it? One afternoon, in the quiet garden of a monastery nestled beneath a canopy of pine and gold leaf trees, I sat with an old monk beside a gentle river. It was autumn, and the leaves had begun their descent, soft orange and crimson bodies floating down like forgotten prayers. We watched in silence for a while. Then he said something I never forgot. Look at the water. It flows without resistance. It doesn't hold on to rocks. It doesn't argue with the curve in its path. It just moves. I watched the way it slipped around stones, glided over roots, spun in playful eddies before calming again, like it had all the time in the world. He turned to me, eyes warm and light-hearted. "Why do you think we suffer so much?" I gave a few thoughtful answers. "Attachment, fear, ego." He smiled gently. "Yes, but beneath it all, it's the illusion of control. We think we can force the river, but the river flows on its own." There's something about those words, simple, almost poetic, that struck a deeper chord in me than any lecture ever had. Maybe because, in that moment, I realized how tightly I'd been holding the reins of my life, how much I'd mistaken control for safety, planning for peace, micromanaging for mindfulness, and how, time after time, life had reminded me I wasn't the river, I was the leaf. It's strange, isn't it? We believe that if we let go, we'll fall, that chaos will swallow us, that everything will come undone. And yet, so often, it's the clinging that hurts more than the release. There's a story, quiet and humble, about a man hanging from a branch. He'd slipped while hiking a steep cliff, and by some miracle, managed to grab onto the lowest branch of a tree growing out of the side. Wind blew fiercely below. Rocks crumbled above. He cried out for help, praying someone would find him. After hours of silence, a voice echoed from the sky. "Let go." He looked down. He couldn't see the bottom, just darkness. Again the voice came, kind but firm. "Let go." But he couldn't. He gripped tighter. His muscles shook. His fingers ached. And eventually, exhausted, he lost his grip and fell exactly 3 feet, right onto solid ground. He had been safe the whole time, but fear kept him hanging. I've been that man. Maybe you have too. Gripping onto a job that no longer fit, simply because the unknown was too terrifying. Holding onto a relationship out of routine rather than love. Saying yes when everything inside you whispered no, just to keep things familiar. We do it because control makes us feel powerful, predictable, protected. But here's the truth I've learned through every unraveling. Control is not peace. It's tension in disguise. It's the illusion of certainty, dressed up like a plan. Life isn't a machine to manage. It's a river to ride. And rivers, well, they have their own wisdom. They know how to move around obstacles. They carry fallen leaves, yes, but they also carry seeds that grow into forests. They cut through mountains not with force, but with flow. Letting go of control doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop gripping. It means you trust that something greater than your worry is already at work. I remember once being offered a career opportunity that looked perfect on paper. The pay, the title, the prestige. Everyone said I'd be crazy to decline it. But something deep in my chest, not fear, but knowing, kept whispering no. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to control the narrative. I wanted the next chapter to be mine. But I let it go. And a few months later, I stumbled into a smaller, quieter opportunity that felt like coming home. Less glamour, more heart. And that path led me to where I am now with you, sharing stories like this. Stories I never would have written if I'd clung to the illusion of the better plan. Sometimes the release is the blessing. But I know it's scary. The in-between always is. So maybe the question is not, how do I control this? But can I trust what's unfolding? Can I trust the current even when I can't see around the bend? Buddhist teachings remind us again and again, impermanence is the only constant. Trying to control life is like trying to hold a handful of water. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips through. But if you cup your hands gently, if you soften, you can hold so much more. There's a practice I often return to when I feel myself spiraling into fix-it mode. It's simple but powerful. I sit quietly, close my eyes, and breathe. Then I ask myself, what am I gripping right now? Sometimes it's a person. Sometimes it's an outcome. Sometimes it's an identity I'm afraid to shed. And then gently I imagine placing it on a leaf and watching that leaf float down the river. Still visible, still real, but not mine to control anymore. Try it sometime. It's not about abandoning responsibility. It's about honoring your limits. It's about choosing presence over pressure. Because the truth is, we don't need control to be safe. We need trust. Trust in ourselves. Trust in our resilience. Trust in the timing of things. Trust in the still, sacred voice that speaks when the noise quiets. You are not the branch. You are not the cliff. You are not the storm. You are the leaf learning to trust the current. And the river already knows the way. Chapter 5. The weight you can finally set down, the gentle power of self-compassion. I once believed that being hard on myself was the only way I'd ever grow. That if I could just point out every flaw first, no one else could beat me to it. That somehow, being my own harshest critic was a kind of strength. But the truth? It wore me down. There's a quiet suffering that comes from constantly judging yourself. It doesn't shout. It hums, like a low, invisible ache that follows you into the morning and curls beside you at night. A voice that says, "You should have known better," or "Why are you still not there yet?" You get used to it. That's the saddest part. You mistake the tension in your shoulders for normal. You call it discipline. You call it motivation. But it's just another form of pain. I remember one evening sitting alone on a temple porch in the mountains of Chiang Mai. The rain had started to fall gently, tapping the stone like it was trying not to wake the earth. There was a monk nearby, sweeping the floor with an old broom, slowly, rhythmically, like he had nowhere else to be. I must have looked heavy, because he stopped, leaned on the broom handle and asked, "Are you carrying something?" I smiled and said, "Yes, myself." He chuckled softly and said, "Then maybe it's time to carry yourself like a sleeping child, not a punishment." That sentence landed somewhere deep in my chest, because I had been dragging myself through life like a burden. Every mistake, every missed opportunity, every moment I wasn't perfect, I carried them like stones in a sack, heavy and silent. And it wasn't until I learned to look at myself with the same kindness I gave others that I realized I could put the sack down. There's a story, you may have heard it, of a man walking a dusty road with a huge bag over his shoulder. Each stone inside was a grudge, a regret, a guilt he had picked up over the years. He refused to let them go, convinced they were his to bear. One day he passed a monk, who saw him bent over and breathless. The monk asked, "Why carry that weight when you could walk freely?" The man answered, "If I let it go, who will remind me of my mistakes?" And the monk said, "But if you hold them forever, how will you ever fly?" I think of that when I catch myself holding too tightly to things that are already done. The moments I've said something I regret. The days I wasn't as patient or wise as I hoped I'd be. The people I hurt when I was still hurting too. And I remember what the monk said to the crying man in the old Zen tale. "A bird with a broken wing cannot fly if it keeps striking itself." We all carry broken pieces. That's part of being human. But breaking ourselves further with shame, that's a wound we can choose not to deepen. In Buddhism, one of the most tender and revolutionary practices is metta bhavana, the meditation on loving kindness. At first glance, it sounds simple. You sit, breathe, and repeat soft phrases like, "May I be well, may I be happy, may I be safe, may I live with ease." But the first time I tried it, I couldn't say the words. Not to myself. I felt ridiculous, unworthy. It was easier to send kindness to a stranger than to this heart I kept punishing. But with time and softness, something shifted. It's like watering a plant you thought was dead, and realizing it was just thirsty. Self-compassion doesn't mean we excuse our mistakes. It means we create the conditions to learn from them without fear, without shame, because growth rooted in love will always reach higher than growth rooted in guilt. And here's the quiet truth the world doesn't tell us enough. Kindness toward yourself is not weakness. It's strength. The rare, luminous kind that glows softly in a world that often demands you hustle, harden, and get over it. Real compassion, especially toward yourself, takes more courage than any perfection. When we begin to treat ourselves as we would a beloved friend, with patience, humor, forgiveness, something profound begins to happen. The mind softens, the breath deepens, and the path ahead feels less like a punishment more like a possibility. I remember once watching a child fall in a courtyard. Not badly, just one of those little stumbles that startle but don't injure. Before the child even had a chance to cry, their grandmother scooped them up with a laugh, saying, "Oops, there you go. Now you've learned where that rock is. No blame, just love." What if we did that for ourselves? What if instead of spiraling into shame every time we trip, we smiled softly and said, "Ah, there's that old rock. I see it now." That's the kind of grace that changes everything. And yet, it's not easy, especially if you've been taught directly or subtly that love has to be earned, that you need to perform, achieve, impress, or redeem yourself before you're worthy of peace. But the Buddha didn't teach that. He taught that suffering arises when we turn away from our own nature. And our nature, at its core, is not a checklist, it's presence, awareness, gentle care, the capacity to begin again. So if today, as you're listening to this, you're carrying something heavy inside, a past version of yourself you're still angry with, a decision you wish you could undo, a season you didn't handle as well as you hoped, maybe this is your invitation to put the sack down, to speak to yourself like someone you love, to sit with the soft rain of self-forgiveness. Here's a practice I often return to. Maybe you'll try it later, maybe even right now. Close your eyes, place your hand on your heart, and breathe. Now imagine yourself as a child, not the perfect version, the real one, messy hair, curious eyes, that version of you who wanted to be loved so badly. Now speak to them, gently, as you would if they were sitting beside you. Tell them you did your best. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're still worthy of love. Even now, especially now, the world is noisy with judgment. But within you, there is a quiet place, like a temple garden, filled with soft light and open sky, where compassion waits like a lantern, always lit. You just have to turn toward it. Let this be that turning, because your heart, tired as it may be, still beats. Your breath still moves, and that means it's not too late. It never was. You are not broken. You are becoming. And when you learn to forgive yourself truly, deeply, you don't just rise. You soar. Chapter 6. The way you walk is the way you wake. Practicing detachment in daily life. I once believed the spiritual path was something I had to arrive at, like a mountaintop with a hidden temple waiting just for me. I imagined that if I could just read enough, meditate enough, perfect myself enough, one day I'd wake up and be there, enlightened, untouched by frustration or fear, floating a few inches above the ground, maybe. But life, in all its gentle wisdom, had something else to teach me. It didn't come during a grand retreat or on some windswept mountaintop. It came one slow morning in a quiet monastery, as I watched an old monk sweep leaves from a stone path. His movements were steady, simple, unhurried. The broom glided like a soft whisper across the ground. He wasn't trying to finish. He was just sweeping. And that's when I heard it. His teacher's words, spoken like a soft bell. If you walk in a hurry, it will take longer. I didn't understand at first. I thought it was just a clever phrase. But now I see the whole world inside that one line. It's not about where you're going. It's about how you're walking. It's not about perfection. It's about presence. Not about reaching, but returning again and again to this moment. Because the spiritual path isn't somewhere outside of you. It's already beneath your feet, in every breath, every step, every choice to return to awareness instead of reaction. But how do we live that? How do we actually integrate these teachings, the wisdom of detachment, of presence, of letting go, into our daily lives? Into the messy, beautiful, ordinary business of being human? That's where the practice begins. Not in theory, but in rhythm. In the little things, the real things, the tea you brew slowly, the email you write with care, the kindness you offer when no one is watching. That is the temple. Let me share with you 6 practices that have helped me return to that quiet center again and again, not as rules but as invitations. The first is gentle detachment. We often think of detachment as something cold, a giving up, a stepping back. But true detachment is soft. It's not letting go with clenched fists. It's opening your hands and realizing, you were never really holding it anyway. Each morning, before the noise sets in, I ask myself, what am I gripping today? And then, can I loosen my hand just a little? Sometimes it's a goal I'm obsessed with. Sometimes it's a person's approval. Sometimes it's just the idea that the day should go a certain way. Detachment doesn't mean I stop caring. It means I stop needing things to unfold according to my script. It means I make space for life to surprise me, and for peace to return, even when things don't go to plan. The second is radical acceptance, and I do mean radical. This isn't the polite kind of acceptance that says, oh well, I guess I'll tolerate this. No, this is the kind that bows to life as it is. The kind that says, yes, this is what's here, and I will meet it with grace. It means waking up, looking in the mirror, and not rushing to fix or judge. It means watching the news and not collapsing into despair, but choosing to respond with clarity. It means noticing your own imperfections, the impatience, the sadness, the longing, and offering them space, not shame. One of my teachers once told me, acceptance isn't the end of the story, it's where the real story begins. And he was right. The third is trusting the unknown. This one takes time, because we've been taught to fear uncertainty. We crave the map, the plan, the guaranteed outcome. But the truth is, the most beautiful chapters of my life have come from pages I never expected to turn. There was a time I thought I had lost everything. A role I loved, a relationship I believed would last, a sense of direction. And in that strange, empty space, something new quietly began to bloom. Trust doesn't mean we never doubt. It means we learn to breathe through the doubt, to walk forward anyway, to believe, even with trembling hands, that life has a wisdom deeper than our worries. The fourth practice is meditation, even just 5 minutes. I used to think I needed an entire altar, the perfect cushion, the right incense. Now, I just need a pause, a quiet breath, a moment of stillness. You don't need to silence your thoughts. You just need to meet them gently. I like to sit with my eyes half closed, hands resting softly, and imagine my breath like a soft wind passing through a forest. Inhale, the leaves lift. Exhale, they settle. Inhale, space. Exhale, peace. Some days my thoughts run wild. Some days, they rest beside me like sleepy cats. But the practice isn't about results. It's about relationship, the one you're building with your own heart. Even one mindful breath, done with care, is a form of prayer. The fifth practice is letting go of outcomes and focusing on intention. We're so conditioned to chase results, to define success by numbers, reactions, applause. But the Buddhist path reminds us, the fruit is not ours to control. Only the planting. Do the action. Release the outcome. Offer the kindness. Release the need to be thanked. Do the work. Release the craving for recognition. Speak the truth. Release the need to be understood. It doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become peaceful. And in that peace, you often find more impact than you ever did through force. I like to think of it as planting a seed in a quiet garden. You water it, you give it light, but you don't tug at the roots to see if it's growing. You trust, and you tend. And the final practice, perhaps the most beautiful, is compassion in the everyday. Not grand gestures, not dramatic forgiveness, just kindness in how you speak, in how you listen, in how you respond to the stranger who bumps your shoulder, or the friend who cancels plans again. And most importantly, kindness to yourself. That moment you forget the teaching, be kind. That time you speak too harshly, be kind. That day you don't meditate, don't breathe, don't get it right, be kind. Because this path, this way of living with awareness, with grace, it's not about perfection. It's about remembering, returning, recommitting, one gentle step at a time. There's a scene I always return to in my memory. It's early morning at the monastery. Mist clings softly to the trees. A bell echoes through the hills. And there, barely visible through the fog, a monk sweeps fallen leaves from the path, one by one, step by step, not rushing, not counting, just sweeping. And in that moment you realize this is the teaching, not in words, in presence, in how you tie your shoes, in how you stir your tea, in how you speak when no one's listening. Every moment is a chance to begin again, to soften, to walk with awareness. So no, the path isn't a place you arrive. It's how you live when you remember that even the smallest moment is sacred. Maybe the cup was always broken, but while it lasted, it shimmered, didn't it? Held in soft hands, admired in the morning light, loved fully even if not forever. We suffer not because things end, but because we believe they shouldn't. Yet in truth, every goodbye holds a seed. Every ending shapes a gentler beginning. You don't need to stop loving, just stop gripping. You don't need to erase the past, just stop dragging it. Hold your life like water in cupped palms, soft, steady, letting it spill when it needs to. And when something breaks, let that be the sound of your soul exhaling. So now I'd love to ask, what is something you've gently released, even when it hurt? Or what are you still learning to loosen your hold on? Share with me in the comments. You're not alone on this journey. And if these reflections resonate with you, I invite you to subscribe. Not just as a viewer, but as a quiet companion walking this shared path of letting go, one breath at a time. We'll meet again soon in the next story, the next still moment, the next opening of the heart. Until then, may you walk gently, may you hold lightly, and may you let life be just as it is.